Racist event planner denies Snoop Dogg, but what happened next shocked everyone. The grand ballroom of the Hamilton Regency Hotel was filled with the buzz of well-dressed executives, celebrities, and socialites. It was the kind of event where high society mingled under crystal chandeliers, exchanging handshakes that could change careers and signing deals over glasses of expensive champagne. At the entrance, a tall man in a sharp navy suit checked the guest list, his brow furrowed in concentration. His name was Richard Carmichael, and he prided himself on running the most exclusive events in the city. Everything had to be perfect. No surprises. No last-minute changes. So when he spotted a tall, laid-back figure in sunglasses, braids, and a gold chain, his entire demeanor shifted. Snoop Dogg had just walked into the event. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line as he quickly stepped forward, blocking the entrance before the rapper could get any further. "Excuse me, sir," Richard said, his voice tight but controlled. "I believe you're at the wrong event." Snoop Dogg lowered his sunglasses slightly, giving Richard a calm but pointed look. "Nah, man, I'm exactly where I need to be." Richard forced a polite chuckle, though his eyes darted to the onlookers who had begun whispering. "I don't think so. This is a private, elite event, and unfortunately, we have very specific guest requirements." Snoop raised an eyebrow, unbothered but clearly reading between the lines. "A word? And what kind of requirements we talking about?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Richard straightened, his fingers tightening around the clipboard in his hand. "I'm sure you understand," he said, lowering his voice. "This isn't your kind of crowd." The moment those words left his mouth, the air shifted. Several guests had stopped their conversations, their eyes flickering toward the confrontation. A few looked uncomfortable. Others smirked, nodding slightly as if to silently agree with Richard. Snoop Dogg let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. "Ain't that something?" he murmured. A tall, older man in a tuxedo approached, recognizing the tension in the air. It was William Hartford, the billionaire CEO who had actually sponsored the event. "Richard, what's going on here?" Hartford asked, glancing between the two men. Richard straightened, eager to explain. "Mr. Hartford, I was just ensuring that our guest list remains exclusive." Snoop exhaled sharply through his nose, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Hartford frowned. "Exclusive?" Richard cleared his throat. "I mean, we have a certain image to uphold, sir." For a moment, Hartford said nothing. Then, slowly, his face darkened. "Richard," Hartford said, his voice turning dangerously quiet. "Do you know who personally invited Snoop Dogg to this event?" Richard faltered. I did," Hartford snapped, cutting him off. "Snoop Dogg is our special guest tonight." The color drained from Richard's face. "Sir, I didn't realize." Snoop Dogg adjusted his sunglasses, his smirk widening. "Man, you should have just said that from the start." Hartford turned to Snoop, shaking his head in frustration. "I deeply apologize for this nonsense. Please, come in, as my honored guest." The tension in the room was palpable as Snoop strolled past Richard, patting the event planner on the shoulder as he passed. "Don't trip, homie," Snoop said. "I know how y'all move." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Richard stood frozen in place, his face burning red with humiliation. But the worst was yet to come. The whispers in the ballroom grew louder as Snoop Dogg casually strode into the event, his every step carrying a level of effortless confidence that Richard Carmichael, the disgraced event planner, could never match. Richard stood rooted in place, his fingers still gripping the clipboard like a lifeline. His perfectly curated evening had just been shattered. Not only had he tried to deny entrance to one of the most famous celebrities in the world, but he had done so in front of the billionaire sponsor of the entire event. He could feel the judging stares, the hushed remarks. Did he really just try to kick out Snoop Dogg? That was a career-ending move right there. What was he thinking? Snoop, meanwhile, had already moved on, completely unbothered. He wasn't the type to hold a grudge over ignorance, but he didn't forget either. At the center of the ballroom, William Hartford, the billionaire CEO who had invited Snoop, cleared his throat. The room quieted as the event's host, an elegant woman in a black evening gown, took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, she announced. "It is an absolute honor to welcome a legend, an icon, and a true inspiration to tonight's event. Please give a warm welcome to our guest of honor, Mr. Snoop Dogg." The audience erupted in applause, people rising to their feet as Snoop stepped forward with that signature laid-back energy. He grabbed the microphone, adjusting his sunglasses before flashing a knowing smile. "Ayo, what's good, y'all?" he said smoothly, his deep voice reverberating through the room. The crowd responded with cheers. Even those who had initially looked down on him were now clapping and smiling, suddenly eager to associate themselves with him. Snoop glanced briefly toward Richard, then back to the crowd. "Man, it's wild, y'all. I almost didn't make it in here tonight." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. "But see," he continued, smirking, "that's the funny thing about life. Some people look at you and decide who you are before they even know your name. They think they can define you based on their own ideas of what exclusive means." Richard swallowed hard. He knew exactly who that message was for. "But I tell y'all what," Snoop said, flashing a grin. "Real success, real greatness, it don't come from turning people away. It comes from lifting people up." The applause swelled again, this time louder, stronger. William Hartford stepped forward, clapping Snoop on the back. "Well said, my friend. And tonight, we celebrate not just talent, but inclusivity and respect." The audience stood, raising their glasses in a toast. Richard felt sick. He had spent his entire career curating the most elite events, ensuring only the right people were allowed in. But in doing so, he had exposed himself as nothing more than a small-minded gatekeeper in a world that was moving past him. But the worst was yet to come. The downfall of Richard Carmichael. The moment the speeches ended and the event transitioned into networking and mingling, Richard tried to sneak away quietly. He had lost all credibility and he knew it. But before he could make it to the exit, William Hartford's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Vanessa, intercepted him. "Mr. Hartford would like to speak with you," she said coolly. Richard forced a smile, nodding stiffly. He followed her to a private seating area where Hartford and a few other powerful figures were gathered. The billionaire's expression was unreadable, but his voice was icy. "Richard," Hartford began, swirling the bourbon in his glass, "tell me something. What exactly made you think you had the authority to deny entrance to my invited guest?" Richard felt his pulse spike. "Sir, I was only trying to uphold the—" Hartford raised a hand, silencing him. "That's not what I asked," he said. "I asked what gave you the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't." Richard floundered, his gaze darting around for support. But the men surrounding Hartford weren't going to save him. They were nodding in agreement with their boss. "Sir, I misunderstood the situation," Richard said quickly. "I had no idea that Mr. Dogg was your guest." Hartford's eyes narrowed. "So you mean to tell me that if Snoop Dogg hadn't been my guest, you would have still turned him away?" Richard's mouth went dry. Hartford leaned forward, placing his glass on the table with a controlled precision that somehow made the moment feel even heavier. "Richard, this company, my company, thrives on inclusivity, diversity, and respect. And tonight, you made it very clear that you do not align with those values." Richard froze. "You've been with us a long time," Hartford continued, "but I can't have someone representing this organization who disrespects my guests." The realization hit Richard like a truck. "Sir, please You're done, Richard." Richard's stomach plummeted. He had just lost his job. One moment of arrogance. One snap judgment. And now, his entire career was over. Snoop's final move. Richard left the event a broken man. Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg? He was having the time of his life. As the night went on, he mingled with some of the most powerful figures in the business world, effortlessly turning skeptics into allies. At one point, as he leaned against the bar sipping his drink, a familiar figure approached. "William Hartford." Snoop nodded in greeting. "What's good, big man?" Hartford smiled. "You know, Snoop, I've met a lot of people in my life, but few handle situations with as much grace and patience as you did tonight." Snoop chuckled. "Man, you gotta learn how to let stuff roll off you. Ain't worth the stress." Hartford's smile widened. "I was actually thinking, how would you feel about partnering on a new project?" Snoop raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Hartford leaned in. I want to fund and co-create a scholarship program for young, underprivileged kids, especially those who dream of breaking into business, entertainment, or entrepreneurship. Snoop's grin widened. Now that's what I'm talking about. And just like that, out of a night of ignorance and discrimination, something good was born. While Richard Carmichael was left jobless and humiliated, Snoop Dogg walked away with new allies, new business opportunities, and an even stronger reputation. The lesson? Never judge someone based on your narrow definition of exclusivity, because the people you look down on might just be the ones shaping the future. And as Snoop left the event that night, he glanced at Richard, who sat alone on a bench outside, his head in his hands. Snoop paused, then smirked. "Keep your head up, man," he said casually. "Maybe next time, you'll know who you messin' with." And with that, he disappeared into the night, a legend, untouchable, unshaken. Snoop Dogg walked out of the grand ballroom, his easygoing demeanor unchanged, but his mind already buzzing with ideas about the scholarship program Hartford had just proposed. He wasn't someone who dwelled on negativity. In fact, he thrived on turning bad situations into opportunities. As he made his way through the hotel lobby, he couldn't help but notice the same event planner, Richard Carmichael, sitting on a bench near the exit. Richard looked utterly defeated, his suit rumpled, his clipboard discarded at his feet. His career, the one he had built on exclusivity and gatekeeping, was crumbling before his eyes. Snoop paused for a moment, considering the man. Most people would have walked away, and for a brief second, Snoop considered doing just that. But then, with his innate sense of grace and humility, he decided otherwise. He turned back and approached the bench, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. "Yo," Snoop called out, his voice smooth and calm. Richard looked up, startled. His face flushed as he realized who was standing in front of him. "Mr. Dogg?" "Nah, don't trip," Snoop interrupted, holding up a hand to stop the apology that was clearly coming. "I ain't here to lecture you. But I do want to ask you something." Richard blinked, unsure of where this was going. What do you want to ask?" Snoop tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on the man. "Why? Why what? Why'd you do it, man?" Snoop asked. "Why'd you look at me, someone you ain't even met before, and decide I wasn't good enough to be here? What made you think I didn't belong?" Richard's face turned red again, and for a moment he was at a loss for words. Finally, he sighed heavily and looked down at his hands. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I was just trying to protect the image of the event. I thought you wouldn't fit the mold." Snoop let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "See, that's where you messed up. You were so focused on keeping up some fake idea of what classy looks like that you forgot what really matters." Richard frowned. "What does matter, then?" "People, man," Snoop said simply. "It's always about the people. Not what they wear, not what they look like, not how much money they got in the bank. It's about what they bring to the table, their heart, their ideas, their vibe. And you, my dude, didn't even give me the chance to show you mine." Richard nodded slowly, his expression shifting from defensive to reflective. "You're right," he said quietly. "I messed up." Snoop smiled faintly, giving him a friendly pat on the shoulder. "Look, I ain't gonna hold it against you. We all make mistakes. But you gotta learn from this one, you feel me? You can't go through life judging people before you even know what they're about." Richard nodded again, this time with a bit more conviction. "You're right. I'll do better." "Good," Snoop said, straightening up. "'Cause the world don't need more gatekeepers. It needs more people who open doors." With that, Snoop walked away, leaving Richard to sit with his thoughts. Over the next few weeks, the fallout from the event spread far and wide. News outlets picked up the story, with headlines like, "Snoop Dogg denied at elite event, but what happened next was unforgettable. Billionaire CEO and Snoop Dogg partner for groundbreaking scholarship program." The incident sparked a larger conversation about exclusivity, prejudice, and gatekeeping in elite circles. Social media exploded with discussions, and many began calling out similar practices in other industries. But the most surprising outcome came from Richard himself. After being fired from his position at the Hamilton Regency Hotel, Richard took a long, hard look at his career and his life. For years, he had been obsessed with creating perfect events, but now he realized that his definition of perfection was narrow-minded and exclusionary. He decided to make a change. Richard started volunteering at local community centers, helping underserved youth learn skills in event planning and management. He reached out to organizations that promoted inclusivity, offering his services pro bono to help them organize events that celebrated diversity. In time, Richard's name began to pop up again in the industry, not as the rigid gatekeeper he once was, but as someone who had completely reinvented himself. Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg and William Hartford worked tirelessly on the scholarship program they had discussed. Dubbed the Level the Field Initiative, the program aimed to provide funding, mentorship, and networking opportunities for young people from underserved communities who wanted to break into fields like business, entertainment, and entrepreneurship. The program launched with a massive event held in Los Angeles, drawing celebrities, business leaders, and philanthropists from around the world. Snoop Dogg, of course, was the star of the night. Standing on stage in front of thousands, Snoop addressed the crowd with his usual charisma. "This right here," he said, gesturing to the banner behind him that read, "Level the Field. This ain't just about scholarships or mentorships. It's about changing the way we think, the way we move, and the way we treat each other." He paused, letting the words sink in. "'Cause at the end of the day, it don't matter where you come from or what you look like. What matters is what you bring to the table. And if we give people a real chance, they'll show you that greatness comes from everywhere." The audience erupted into applause, and Hartford stepped forward to shake Snoop's hand. "This initiative wouldn't exist without you," Hartford said into the microphone. "And I'm honored to stand beside you as we open doors for the next generation." Months later, as the scholarship program gained momentum and success stories began to emerge, Snoop received a surprising email. It was from none other than Richard Carmichael. In the email, Richard explained how the incident at the Hamilton Regency Hotel had been a turning point in his life. He thanked Snoop for the lesson in humility and for inspiring him to become a better person. He also shared some exciting news. Richard had just been hired by a non-profit organization that focused on organizing events for charitable causes. Snoop read the email with a satisfied smile. He didn't need an apology. Richard's actions spoke louder than words. As he replied to the email, his message was short and sweet. "Glad to see you leveling up, homie. Keep opening doors." In the years that followed, the Level the Field initiative became one of the most successful scholarship programs in the country, helping thousands of young people achieve their dreams. Snoop Dogg continued to use his platform to advocate for inclusivity, proving time and time again that kindness and understanding could have a greater impact than anger or resentment. And Richard Carmichael? He became a living example of how people could change for the better when they were willing to learn from their mistakes. The lesson was clear. When you stop judging others and start embracing the power of diversity, incredible things can happen. And it all started with a moment of ignorance, a spark of grace, and the unstoppable presence of a man named Snoop Dogg. Snoop Dogg sat back in his home studio, scrolling through the countless messages flooding his inbox. The impact of the Level the Field initiative was growing larger than even he had anticipated. Messages from students who had received scholarships, young entrepreneurs who had gained mentorship, and artists who had been given a real shot at success kept pouring in. He grinned as he read one from a young woman who had just landed her first business investment because of the connections she made through the program. This was exactly what he had envisioned when Hartford first pitched the idea to him. A knock on the studio door pulled him from his thoughts. His longtime friend and business partner, Ray, peeked inside. "Yo, you got a visitor." Snoop raised an eyebrow. "I'd send him in." When the door swung open, he was met with the last person he expected to see, Richard Carmichael. Dressed in a more relaxed but still professional outfit, Richard stepped inside cautiously, holding a small envelope in his hands. Snoop leaned back in his chair, eyeing him with a smirk. Well, if it ain't my boy Richard. What brings you to my neck of the woods?" Richard cleared his throat. I just wanted to stop by and personally thank you." Snoop raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Richard hesitated before stepping closer, setting the envelope on the table in front of him. "For everything. You could have embarrassed me. You could have made an example out of me. But instead, you taught me a lesson that I didn't even realize I needed to learn." He sighed, shaking his head. "I spent so much of my career trying to create these so-called exclusive experiences, thinking that meant keeping people like you out. But I was wrong. And I've spent the last year trying to make up for that mistake." Snoop studied him for a moment, then picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter and a donation check to the Level the Field initiative. Richard shifted on his feet. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or anything. I just wanted to show you that I've changed, that I understand now. And I want to be part of the solution instead of the problem." Snoop nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's what's up." He set the check down and stood up, extending his hand. "It takes a real man to own up to his mistakes." "Respect." Richard exhaled, clearly relieved as he shook Snoop's hand. "I appreciate that. And if there's ever anything I can do, anything at all, let me know." Snoop chuckled. "You already doing it, homie." Richard left feeling lighter than he had in years. The weight of his past mistakes was still there, but now he had the chance to use them as lessons instead of regrets. As for Snoop, he simply sat back in his chair, shaking his head with a grin. Life's funny, man. And just like that, what had started as an act of prejudice had turned into something far greater, a reminder that change is always possible, and that sometimes, all it takes is a little humility and the right person willing to show you a different way. Snoop leaned back in his chair, shaking his head as he thought about how things had unfolded. The world had a way of surprising you. Who would have thought that the same man who had tried to keep him out of an event would now be standing in his studio, trying to make things right? He glanced at the check Richard had left on the table. It wasn't about the money, it was about the gesture, the effort to atone for past mistakes. That was real growth. Ray sat across from him, picking up the envelope and whistling low. "Man, that's a hefty check." Snoop nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "It ain't about that though. It's about a dude realizing how he was moving and deciding to change it. That don't happen every day." Ray smirked. "You think he's for real?" Snoop shrugged. "Time will tell. But you can feel when someone's sincere, and I think dude really gets it now." There was a comfortable silence as they both sipped their drinks, the hum of the studio's sound system filling the space. Then, Ray leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You ever think about what's next?" Snoop raised an eyebrow. "Next for what?" Ray gestured around them. "This whole thing, man. The initiative's popping off, people are getting real opportunities, and you're making moves outside of music like never before. But I know you ain't the type to just sit back and chill." Snoop chuckled. "Nah man, that ain't my style." He exhaled, rubbing his chin. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy, you know? Like what's gonna be here when I'm gone? Not just in music, but in the world." Ray nodded. "Yeah man. And you already building that with the scholarship program?" Snoop nodded. "True, but there's more to do. I've been talking with some folks about expanding it. Not just scholarships, but full-on mentorships, investment programs for young entrepreneurs, internships for kids who want to get into the industry, whether that's music, business, tech, whatever." Ray grinned. "You talking about a whole empire?" Snoop smirked. "Something like that." The idea had been on his mind for a while now. The Level the Field initiative was just the beginning. He wanted to create something lasting, something that would continue opening doors long after he was gone. He had seen too many talented young people get shut out of opportunities simply because they didn't have the right connections or background. That was about to change. The next few months were a whirlwind. Snoop assembled a team of industry leaders, entrepreneurs, and educators, all dedicated to expanding the initiative. They created training programs, networking events, and business incubators to help young people turn their ideas into reality. Major companies took notice, offering partnerships to help fund and support the movement. Celebrities and athletes began contributing, wanting to be part of something bigger than themselves. And then came the biggest move of all. Snoop, along with his team, secured land to build an actual facility, a physical headquarters where young entrepreneurs, artists, and creators could come to learn, collaborate, and grow. It would be part school, part incubator, part creative hub. The announcement sent shockwaves through the industry. No one had ever attempted something on this scale before. The grand opening was set to be a massive event, attended by some of the most influential names in entertainment, business, and tech. Media outlets flooded the news with headlines about how Snoop Dogg was changing the game yet again. But the most unexpected moment came just a few days before the launch. Snoop was at the site, overseeing the final touches when one of his assistants approached him with a puzzled expression. "You're not gonna believe this," she said, handing him an envelope. He opened it, eyes scanning the contents. It was a formal request to attend the grand opening, from Richard Carmichael. Snoop chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, this dude really trying to come full circle, huh?" Ray, standing beside him, raised an eyebrow. "You gonna let him?" Snoop thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah. Let's see if he really about what he's saying." The day of the event arrived, and the energy was electric. Cameras flashed, reporters lined the entrances, and the guest list read like a who's who of the industry. And then, just as the speeches were about to begin, Richard Carmichael walked through the doors. Dressed more humbly than before, he looked around in awe at what had been built. The very industry he had spent years trying to keep exclusive was now something he had been excluded from, until now. Snoop spotted him from across the room, gave him a nod, then turned back to the crowd. When he took the stage, the applause was deafening. He let it settle before speaking. "This right here?" He gestured to the building behind him. "This ain't just a place. This is a statement. This is about changing the narrative. About making sure the next generation don't gotta beg for a chance. They just gotta be ready to take it." The crowd cheered, and he continued. "I've been in this game a long time, and I seen how it works. Some folks want to keep things locked up, keep the power in their own hands, make sure only a certain type of person gets to sit at the table." His eyes flickered to Richard for the briefest moment, but then he looked back out at the sea of young faces watching him, hanging on to his every word. "Well, we ain't playing by those rules no more." Thunderous applause. "This place is for everyone who got the talent, the drive, and the vision to make something happen. And trust me, y'all, this is only the beginning." The event ended with an overwhelming sense of hope and possibility. Deals were made, mentorships were formed, and the first wave of young creators walked through the doors, knowing they now had a place to turn their dreams into reality. As Snoop was making his way out, Richard approached him hesitantly. "I have no words for how incredible this is," Richard admitted. "I never would have imagined something like this." Snoop studied him for a moment, then smiled. "That's the difference, man. Some of us imagine bigger." Richard exhaled, nodding. "You're right. And I want to help." Snoop raised an eyebrow. "How?" Richard pulled out a business card. "I still have connections. Corporate sponsors, event planning expertise. I can help bring in more funding, organize more networking events. If you'll let me." Snoop considered the offer. He knew Richard had changed, but was he ready to let him in? After a moment, he reached out and took the card. "Aight, Richard. Let's see what you got." And just like that, a man who had once denied Snoop entrance to an event was now being given a second chance to prove himself, but this time, on Snoop's terms. As the sun set over the new headquarters, Snoop looked out over the bustling energy of young minds ready to change the world. And he knew this was just the beginning. The night air was cool, carrying with it the faint echoes of the day's celebrations. The opening of the level the field headquarters had been an overwhelming success, drawing in some of the most influential figures from business, entertainment, and tech. But more importantly, it had brought real opportunities to those who needed them the most. Young entrepreneurs, aspiring artists, and future leaders now had a place to learn, grow, and create without the barriers that had held so many back before. Snoop stood on the rooftop terrace of the new building, taking it all in. Below him, the last of the attendees were filtering out, their conversations buzzing with excitement about what had just been launched. The city skyline stretched before him, glowing with possibility. Ray leaned against the railing next to him, nodding in approval. "Man, you really did it. This place is gonna change lives." Snoop exhaled, a slow, satisfied breath. "That's the plan." From the corner of his eye, he noticed Richard Carmichael standing near the exit, watching the scene with an expression that was hard to read. The man looked different from when they had first met, less rigid, more introspective. "You gonna talk to him?" Ray asked, following Snoop's gaze. Snoop nodded. "Yeah. Let's see what he's really about." He made his way down, his signature smooth stride carrying him effortlessly through the remaining guests. As he approached, Richard straightened up, his posture instinctively formal, as if he still expected to be judged. "You sticking around?" Snoop asked, his tone neutral. Richard nodded. "I wanted to see the place when it was empty. Get a feel for what it's really about." Snoop smirked. "And?" Richard let out a small chuckle. "It's humbling. And impressive. You've built something that people like me spent years pretending didn't need to exist." Snoop raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think now?" Richard hesitated, then met Snoop's gaze. "I think I was wrong. About a lot of things." There was a weight to his words, an honesty that Snoop hadn't expected. He had seen a lot of people talk about change, but few actually followed through. Still, Richard had shown up, again and again, not just with words, but with actions. "I meant what I said earlier," Richard continued. "I have connections, sponsors, resources. I know how to put together the kind of events that attract major investors. And if you'll let me, I want to use all of that to help this initiative grow." Snoop studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly he nodded. "Aight, Richard. You got a shot." Richard let out a breath of relief, but Snoop wasn't done. "But hear me when I say this. You mess up again, there ain't gonna be no second chances. This ain't about money, this ain't about clout. This is about real people's lives. You down with that?" Richard swallowed hard and nodded. "I understand. And I won't mess this up." Snoop extended his hand. Richard hesitated for only a second before shaking it, sealing the most unexpected partnership of his life. The next few months were a whirlwind. Under Richard's guidance, the Level the Field initiative attracted some of the biggest corporate sponsors in the world. Companies that had never considered investing in underprivileged communities were now lining up to partner, fund, and expand the project. For the first time, students from low-income backgrounds had direct access to industry professionals who could guide them, mentor them, and connect them to real opportunities. Richard worked tirelessly, proving his loyalty through his dedication. He personally oversaw networking events, ensuring that the young entrepreneurs who came through the program weren't just given temporary opportunities, but real career paths. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraising gala, Richard found himself standing alone in the now-empty event hall. He had spent his entire career chasing exclusivity, believing that power belonged only to those who had been born into it. Now, he realized true power came from opening doors, not closing them. Snoop entered the hall, watching Richard with his usual knowing smirk. "You look like a man who just had a revelation." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "I guess I did." Snoop sat down at one of the empty tables, gesturing for Richard to join him. "So tell me, man, what's next?" Richard exhaled, staring at the glass of water in front of him. "I think I finally found my purpose," he admitted. "For years, I thought success meant keeping people out. But now, I want to be known as the guy who brings people in." Snoop nodded approvingly. "That's what's up." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the journey they had both taken settling between them. Then Snoop grinned. "You know, Richard, you might actually turn out all right." Richard chuckled. "I hope so." As the months passed, the Level the Field initiative became bigger than anyone had ever imagined. More centers were built, more students were placed in careers, and the initiative expanded to include global partnerships. And through it all, Snoop Dogg remained the driving force behind it. Not just as a celebrity figurehead, but as a man who had lived through the struggle, who understood what it meant to be doubted and underestimated, and who was determined to make sure that the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles alone. One day, at the grand opening of yet another new facility, Snoop found himself standing in front of a fresh wave of young dreamers, all looking at him with wide eyes full of hope. He adjusted his sunglasses, flashing that signature smirk before addressing the crowd. "Y'all see this?" he asked, gesturing to the building behind him. "This right here, this is the future. And the crazy thing? This ain't even the peak. We just getting started." The cheers were deafening. And as Snoop looked out over the faces in the crowd, he knew that this, not the money, not the fame, not even the music, was his real legacy.